In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Luther and Calvin on the subject of predestination. And if there's any doctrine, any subject that needs some explanation before we even dive into the historical teachings of these two men, it's the subject of predestination. Too often what is said, and we've commented on this before when we looked at Calvin and Calvinism, but too often it's assumed that the doctrine of predestination is a Calvinistic doctrine, as if Calvin himself is the only one who ever taught this doctrine, as if it sprung from his mind alone, and therefore it's the Calvinists who are to blame for all of this talk of the subject of predestination. Well, that reality of the way Calvinism is viewed as the sort of standard bearer of predestinarian language comes about itself from historical contexts. The first, of course, is the Arminian debate of the 17th century. There is the famous Synod of Dort, which laid out the concepts of what today is called the 5 points of Calvinism. Now, first and foremost, we want to say that this understanding of Calvinism, as if it's merely 5 points, or as if the 5 points that are described at the Synod of Dort are themselves Calvin's teachings, we're going to have to resist. Because the fact of the matter is the Synod of Dort, while certainly within the context of the Reformed faith, and while not necessarily antithetical to the teachings of Calvin, do come from the context of the Reformed world, and Calvin obviously is part of that Reformed world. There are some doctrines that Calvin never says anything about, for example, limited atonement. Or if he says something about them, he certainly doesn't say anything with the same clarity that is said at the Synod of Dort. So the Arminian Calvinist debate in the 17th century of the Netherlands has given shape and vocabulary to this debate that we carry on today. At least they're often cited as issues today. Now, we should go ahead and dispel the myth that the Synod of Dort came up with something called tulip. Well, first and foremost, no one at the Synod of Dort spoke English. The language of choice would have been Latin, or for the locals, it would have been Dutch, and they certainly would not have come up with an English acronym for how to understand the 5 points. Moreover, Arminianism itself was coming out of the Reformed world. Arminius had been a student of Beza, who was obviously a student of Calvin's. And so the Arminian Calvinist debate was really a pregnant moment in the development of Reformed language, as it sought to clarify and to articulate, again, more deeply than Calvin himself does, some of the doctrines that they were holding. The other historical context involves the teachings of John Wesley. John Wesley, of course, was perhaps the finest early preacher in the New World. He and George Whitefield, both friends, though Whitefield, strangely enough, a Calvinist, both rode up and down the circuit, preaching revival and evangelizing those in the New World. Well, Wesley was an Arminian, and beyond that, he was a pretty zealous anti-Calvinist. It is to Wesley that a number of the urban legends about Calvin's teachings and some of the ferocity of the anger amongst people who come from the Wesleyan revivalist tradition, whether they know it or not, comes as a genealogy from Wesley himself. So setting aside the issue that Calvin is to be sort of understood only in the light of these two later figures or moments, we need to look at it in the context of its own day. Because here's the thing, Calvin was not the first to talk about predestination. He was not the only one, in the Reformation in particular. In fact, almost to a man, the early reformers themselves taught a generic understanding of predestination. Cranmer taught it, Calvin taught it, Luther taught it, Melanchthon, others. What we have to look at, though, is the shading of it. Put simply, it is the basic Protestant assumption that we are dead in our sins and that we need a Savior. And avoiding the language of our own works and our own merit that was systemic in the Middle Ages, the Reformers always erred with a view that God has saved us. We have not saved ourselves. We have not contributed one iota of the obedience to the law that Christ himself had accomplished. So that's the base. The base is all of the Reformers in some way teach the doctrine of predestination. The next thing to realize, though, is that they're not the first in the history of the church to teach this doctrine. There is an entire wellspring of folks going back at least to Augustine, though it can be argued that it goes back to the patristic age as well before him. But certainly since Augustine, there was an accent, you might say, an underscoring of God's work for us and of God's choosing us before we have chosen him. before we have responded to him. In some ways, to say that you are Augustinian to this day has at root this idea that you believe in unmerited grace, that God has rescued us and saved us and called us, and that all of our response to God is read in the light of his calling us first. So that's part one. We have to get off this idea that only Calvin talks about predestination. The next thing we need, though, is some very careful language as to what we mean by predestination in terms of theology, before we get down deep into what Luther and Calvin said on this doctrine and the places that they differed. First and foremost, we have to realize that when it comes to what God knows and what he is sovereign over, the two traditional doctrines that people affirm, or the two traditional places where people discuss God's sovereignty, usually fall into two categories. The first is the subject of what God does in salvation of individuals. So let's take a basic person, John or Jane Doe, and let's say that they convert, that they had never heard the name of Christ before, that when hearing the gospel preached, they convert, and now they are Christians, and the rest of their life is lived in the grace and mercy of the gospel in the context of a church. Well, the first place, again, that we're discussing this issue of predestination is here in this context. It is simply, when John or Jane Doe has converted, did they somehow invite God into their heart, and then God has moved and agreed to save them and justify them and all these things? Or was there some pre-movement by God that saved us, that called us, that rescued us? This subject, in other words, is the classic doctrine of predestination. In other words, predestination does not have in play the question fundamentally as to whether or not God is in control of all events. Is God in control of the words I'm saying right now? Did he somehow cause them to come about? Did he bring them about? Did he plan for me to be talking to you right now through this microphone? Those issues are not in play when we're discussing the subject of predestination in the classical sense. In other words, predestination does not have in play the question of fatalism. I always tell students that the issue of predestination is who moved first, you or God. If God moves first, if he somehow enacts something within you, brings something about in your life that causes you to then have a heart of flesh, taking out that heart of stone, if he has given you the ears to hear the gospel in the first place, well, that is what is in play with the doctrine of predestination. On the other side of the equation, though, is the subject of what God's role is in the context of certain events. But here's the thing. When we're discussing God's sovereignty classically, we're not discussing first and foremost, at least not typically, at least not until well after the Reformation, we're not discussing first and foremost God's control over every single event. People do discuss this. This is one of the subjects that comes about. However, on the subject of whether or not God is in control of things, that subject is usually ranged under the subject of where is God in the midst of evil. Let me put it this way. No one doubts that God is in control when things are good. If you have blessing, if something good happens, people say thanks be to God, no problem. Everyone's fine with God being in control of good events. The question people usually have is, where was he when the nuclear bomb went off in our life? Where was he in 9/11? Where was he when the tsunami hit? Very, very painful questions. And the instinct of all Christians is never to say that God was asleep at the wheel, that he lacked control, that he was unable to stop it in some fundamental sense. And so the big debate, the big question on that side of the equation is always, where is God in the midst of trouble? So right here and now, you can see the issue we're discussing now is predestination. We're discussing salvation. When John or Jane Doe come to faith, the question is who moved first? And this has an enormous practical pastoral issue built within it. Because as both the debate tends to go, and frankly, as some of the scriptures seem to indicate, if there's some way of saying that we affected our own salvation, well, then it would seem to be the case that the entirety of the Christian life is lived out in the effort to maintain that salvation, or else we might fall away. Those who tend to go for predestination, Calvin, Luther, Cranmer, others, Augustine, tend to see the problem here And they see it as a problem in Scripture. In the places in Scripture where the doctrine of predestination is discussed, very often those who fall in the predestinarian camp in the general sense want to say that I did not choose God. I was dead in my sins. I was far away. He rescued me. And therefore, the things of the Christian life that I see, things like sanctification, deep love of Christ, the ongoing effects of the Christian life, are not dependent, first and foremost, on me, because I did not move first. So, here we are at a very sort of foundational point. All of the reformers in the first generation have some doctrine of predestination built within their system. And since the doctrine of predestination is first and foremost about who moves first, did God give me ears to hear the gospel before I actually heard it and embraced it? Well, if that's the context, is it okay to say that Calvin and Luther differ on the doctrine of predestination? Well, there's really two camps here. There's one that I think is a bit ahistorical, and then there's one that I believe is based on the actual reading of these two theologians. First and foremost, in the modern evangelical, Protestant, or just wider Christian world, there are people who do not embrace predestinarian language at all. They'll come up with some other concept, maybe Arminianism, something like this, and they'll sit back and say, look, I'm not going to talk about predestination at all. God didn't move first. I invited him in, and he has saved me as a result. And there's so many variety of folks that come from this position that what ends up happening in the modern world is when people read Luther and they find predestinarian language, very often what happens is they sit back and they say, well, boy, Luther's on Calvin's side. Luther's a Calvinist, as strange as it might seem to say that. What's also going on here is, again, the amount of attack that quote-unquote Calvinists get as a result of the doctrine of predestination tends to mean that whenever someone gets into historical studies, or if they read Luther or someone else from the Reformation besides Calvin, whenever they find this doctrine of predestination, they usually have a eureka moment. They realize that this is something historical that is being embraced during the Reformation, and that all those in the modern world who might have problems with the doctrine of predestination can now be told that it's not Calvin alone who is to blame for this language. But is that where Calvin and Luther are coming from in the context of their own day? The short answer is they do not agree, Calvin and Luther, on the doctrine of predestination. What do I mean? Well, it all comes down to, in a manner of speaking, the way we talk about predestination and the way predestination is used in the context of the Christian life. Let's start with Luther. Luther, you can find all kinds of comments throughout the early, middle, and late period of his ministry and his writing, places where Luther has said, either in name or at least in principle, that he is in favor of the doctrine of predestination. It only makes sense, after all. Let's go back to Luther's breakthrough. Luther's breakthrough is basically hinged on the problem of what works he needs to do to make God love him. That was the belief that he had instilled within him in the monastery. And Luther's breakthrough is essentially a fundamental conviction from the book of Romans that God has chosen us, that God has redeemed us, that his work is what is sufficient. And you carry that forward to 1525, when Luther writes The Bondage of the Will. What you tend to have is a very rigorous, pretty serious case for the idea that Luther is very much in favor of the doctrine of predestination. Here's the problem, though. Lutherans today, save a few, do not believe in the doctrine of predestination, and they tend to get a bit chippy whenever they are told that they teach the same thing as Calvin. Well, why is that? Well, let's go to Calvin now. Let's see how he has developed his language. Calvin, when he discusses the doctrine of predestination, comes from it from the same vantage as Luther. His first issue is, when John or Jane Doe has converted, do we say that they have called upon God and he has responded? Or do we say that it is God who has rescued them, given them ears to hear, given them a heart of flesh, these kinds of things? Calvin is with Luther on this question. Absolutely, he says. It is not up to us, our choice, our invitation to God for him to then save us or to justify us. Calvin, just like Luther at this point, will say, God was at work for our salvation before we were ever aware of it. And if it were not for the work of God in regenerating and renovating our heart, then we would not have had the capacity to respond to the gospel in the first place. Okay, so where do they differ? Well, they differ in terms of the application of the description of what God knows and what he is doing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how the Christian is supposed to live this life out. And I want to cite for you some passages from Luther's lectures on the book of Genesis that come during the last several years of his life. Luther writes, "I hear that here and there among the nobles, and persons of importance, vicious statements are being spread concerning predestination or God's foreknowledge. For this is what they say: if I am predestined, I shall be saved, whether I do good or evil. If I am not predestined, I shall be condemned, regardless of my works." Now, the people that Luther is referring to are a bit hard to pin down. He's referring to noble folk and people, I think, within his context of Germany. He is not at this point referring to Calvin or others. So he's not here necessarily attacking the doctrine of Calvinism or of Calvin or the Reformed world. But there is some sort of jab going on here. Now, what is it? Well, it seems to be the case that what Luther begins to articulate from within his theology late in life is a real aversion to those who describe predestination in a way that they somehow are aware of what predestination means for their lives definitively. Even the phrase here that people say, well, it doesn't matter what I do, doesn't matter about church, it just matters whether or not I am predestined. If I do these things in the church life, if I partake of the sacraments, if I believe with all my heart, but I am not predestined, Luther alleges, these people will say that they will be damned. However, he says those who do nothing, attend church never, but have some sort of eternal predestination within their heart, Luther alleges that these people believe that those people are elect no matter what. Now, first and foremost, we should say that this caricature that Luther gives is nothing that anyone in Calvinism or Calvin himself ever taught. No one has ever said that it is irrelevant to see the expression of faith or the Christian life or any of these things for one to understand one's place in God's salvation. You might say that what Luther is describing here is some sort of mutated Frankenstein hyper-Calvinism. Because again, this is not the teachings of Calvin, nor is the teachings of anyone in the Reformed world. But what Luther has a problem with here is that he feels that at this point, the doctrine of predestination has grown out of its proper place. You'll recall that when we were looking at Calvin's Institutes, one of the things we noticed is that for Melanchthon and Calvin, when they're looking at the subject of the order of, say, the book of Romans, there's a very interesting fact, which is that the doctrine of predestination in that book is actually discussed after the doctrine of justification, in terms of topic, in terms of the way that it is brought up in the context of the book of Romans. We don't want to put too fine a point on that. It's not as if Paul has them as far as east is from west. But what Luther begins to be concerned about is that people are somehow believing that they can understand, or that it is somehow irrelevant to the Christian life, that they can understand either their place in God's predestined plan, or that they have somehow become neutered to the things of the church in the sacramental system. He goes on to say in other places that people will no longer take part of the sacraments. Who cares about listening and hearing the preached word? Suddenly it all becomes, well, if I'm predestined, I'm in, so I might as well just kind of wait around and see what happens whenever I die. In other words, for Luther, he's actually going to really significantly pump the brakes on any discussion on the doctrine of predestination. He thinks that any discussion of this kind is unbiblical because he feels that it doesn't follow the pattern of Scripture. For Luther, as we've seen, justification is first and foremost hearing the preached word, hearing the condemnation of the law, and believing, then partaking of the sacraments, and then resting fully in the work of Christ. Luther elsewhere will say that predestination is something you talk about only after you have thoroughly rested on justification. Now, he doesn't mean that once you've had a conversion experience. What he means is predestination, in Luther's sort of overall pastoral approach to the subject, is what you do to make sure that people don't forget that their justification is not based on their own will or their own work. In other words, let's go back to the sort of flow of the Lutheran service. The law is preached, one feels guilty and judged, then they hear the good grace of the gospel. Then they partake of the sacraments, And it is only possibly at this point that a Lutheran will say, now realize that you have been rescued. You did not rescue yourself. Your faith is not a work that you have accomplished. It's not some sort of backdoor way of becoming Pelagian. Rather, God rescued you, and the only way you know that is because you felt condemned, you experienced justification, the grace of that, the breakthrough of that, and you have partaken in the sacraments. In other words, what Luther is most concerned about is the way some are describing predestination apart from the sacraments in the normal flow of the worship of the church, making the sacraments and the church irrelevant to the question of justification and therefore irrelevant to the question of predestination, makes the person, again, neutered, makes them irrelevant. They just simply sit around and wait to determine if they are predestined. In other words, for Luther, the question, the concern, is that if someone gets overly zealous about this doctrine of predestination, then they will believe that there is nothing that they do or experience or know in this Christian life that has anything to do with their salvation. He goes on to say, this is how I have taught it in my book on the bondage of the will, namely that a distinction must be made when one deals with the knowledge, or rather the subject, of God. For one must debate either about the hidden God or about the revealed God. With regard to God, insofar as he has not been revealed, there is no faith, no knowledge, and no understanding. And with them, nothing more is achieved than that we plunge ourselves into destruction. Well, where does Calvin come down on the subject of predestination? Well, we can affirm in general that Calvin does not differ with Luther in general on the doctrine of predestination. He affirms it. He affirms it in many of the same ways that Luther does. He believes that God's choice is the most important factor in our salvation. He rejects the concepts of works or merit or any kind of reciprocity on the part of humans to achieve their own salvation. But from that point, there is a divergence. Calvin does not share Luther's concern for discussing the doctrine of predestination openly or objectively, or frankly for discussing the doctrine only within the context of having already considered the doctrine of justification. Calvin actually has a more robust desire to talk about the doctrine of predestination in what we might call an objective sense. What is the doctrine? How are we to understand it? It's not simply located as a safeguard against Pelagianism, though for Calvin it certainly serves as that doctrine. Calvin, you might say, is more willing to talk about the doctrine of predestination in a way that is from the vantage of a systematic theologian. Calvin does not have a pastoral or homiletics concern with discussing the doctrine of predestination on its own merit. Rather, for Calvin, and we see this in the Institutes and in other places in his writings, he will discuss the doctrine of predestination as a locus unto itself. And he gets to this point because he believes that because the scriptures talk about it openly, that there is no need to exert more caution on that doctrine in how it's discussed in the context of the Christian life. And this leads Calvin to other conclusions as well. Calvin is willing to take on the question of what God's role is in what we call the reprobate. That is to say, those who ultimately do not believe and therefore receive damnation. Calvin says it's perfectly legitimate, because the Bible talks about it, in particular in the book of Romans, to discuss biblically and pastorally the reality that God has, on some level, chosen to pass over those who are not going to receive faith. Now, Calvinism is too often associated with the doctrine of predestination, full stop. It's believed at times that Calvin, and therefore Calvinists, or those in the Reformed faith, dwell overly long on the subject of the reprobate, or who are the elect, etc. The fact is, for Calvin, that's really not the case. He shares the doctrine with Luther and with others. Where Calvin differs at times with those in the Reformation era, though, is in his willingness to go to what he believes are the biblical conclusions on God's role not only with the elect, with those whom he has chosen and called and redeemed, but also with those who are the reprobate, the non-elect. And Calvin stands tall on the verse in Romans, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. And he says this opens up the question that we have to ask, which is, why did God not choose everyone to salvation? And for Calvin, again, like so many in the Reformation era, His conclusion is that God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, is not to be held to our standard as to why he has not saved everyone. He points out elsewhere, of course, that the only alternative to the idea that God was not somehow choosing or passing over those whom he chose to save is to either embrace a universal salvation, that God is somehow saving everyone, or to embrace the idea that God was somehow unable to save everyone, and he lost a few along the way. So for Calvin, unlike Luther, he's willing to stare that in the face, and he's willing to deal with the thorny problem of what we call theodicy, or the problem of evil. Why is there evil in this world? Why has God not put it all to right immediately? And why does God allow those who are evil to continue even to their own damnation? And his conclusion is more pastoral than it might seem. Calvin's concern primarily with his doctrine of predestination is not so much determining who is the elect. Calvin never goes there. He does not believe it is within our right or our capability of determining who is elect and who isn't. Rather, he says, God alone knows. Rather, for Calvin, it's more about confidence in the preached word and in the gospel. He says if a pastor preaches, and let's say hypothetically half come to salvation, half do not, the question has to be asked, what happened? Why did the half that did not come to salvation fail to hear the gospel? And Calvin's answer, resting entirely on Romans, though obviously there are other scriptures as well, is that God has chosen at this point not to save. Now, one of the great myths here, of course, is that some allege that for Calvin, this makes you entirely incapable of sharing the gospel. The old frozen chosen mythology, the idea that those who embrace some level of understanding of predestination somehow sit back and say, well, I'm one of the elect. God will save whom he saves. It doesn't matter. Calvin doesn't see it that way. Calvin, from beginning to end, argues that the doctrine of predestination can be discussed as a locus of the discussion of the Christian life. We have to say, if I have faith, if I exhibit this, I can rest confident on the fact that God has saved me. I am not about my own salvation here. The Christian life is hard. Sanctification is piecemeal. And so we don't sit back and say, well, if I'm not seeing sanctification with the speed or the quality that I expect it to be in my life, well, God is about me long before I was about him. He has chosen me, and therefore I can rest assured in that reality. My conscience is not terrified, trying to determine if I'm one of the elect, but rather, if I see the exhibition of faith at all in my life, I can know that it wasn't put there by a figment of my own imagination. When it comes to evangelism, when it comes to the preached word, when it comes to missionary work, we might say in the modern world, Calvin actually will argue that the doctrine of predestination actually undergirds that call to ministry. In a strange twist, Calvin is, in many ways, the furthest from a frozen chosen than you could ever imagine. For him, it's not up to the preacher. It's not up to my faithfulness for the gospel to go forth. Rather, he says, I can preach, I can teach, I can tell anyone, no matter how seemingly far off it might be, about the gospel, because God is the one who saves. And he is hopeful, he is optimistic that God works through the ordinary means of the preached word in the ministry of the church. So, in conclusion, Luther and Calvin, in a strange way, share many of the same principles on the doctrine of predestination. Where they differ, though, is on the application of it. Luther is entirely hesitant to ever really talk about this doctrine in any capacity other than to say, you did not save yourself. Focus instead, he will argue, on justification and on the terror of the law and of the promise of the gospel. He does not want to talk about predestination. Calvin, on the other hand, is open to talking about it. He wants to talk about it. He wants it to be part of our ongoing conversations about the biblical witness. And if there's anything that really creates a trajectory in different directions, you see this worked out in the legacy of Lutheranism on the one hand and the legacy of the Reformed faith on the other. Lutherans, to this day, are entirely hesitant to talk about the doctrine of predestination. And in some cases, they'll deny vociferously that they share much of the same doctrine that Calvin does. The Reformed faith, by and large, though, those who rest in large part on the teachings of Calvin, as well as others, are not frightened away from the discussion. In some ways, they'll talk about it just as often as they want to. And it's for that reason, frankly, that the doctrine of predestination has become, in some ways, wrongly, I might say historically, but in some ways has become wrapped up entirely as part of the Reformed tradition. Though so many of the Reformers taught this doctrine and believed it, it's in the application of this doctrine that we see a split and we see a change of direction. And that change, in many ways, is still in effect today. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to look at Luther on the third use of the law.